Hello and welcome to QT Anatomy Live. I'm your presenter, Dr. Laura Gregory. Let's start by breaking down the terms osteology and arthrology. Osteology is the study of bones and arthrology the study of joints. The adult human skeleton consists of 206 bones. Whilst bones may look dry and static, in the living person, they are actually highly dynamic organs with complex cell signalling behaviours. You may say that bones have ears because they're extremely sensitive to their external environment. Right now, inside your body, your bones are detecting the loads that are placed upon them. So let's wake up our bones, get out of our seats, and do a couple of star jumps. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. Phew! Just that small amount of exercise has already stimulated our bone cells to start adapting the skeleton. In this way, the internal architecture reorganises itself to increase its strength to meet the demands of the higher loads. How brilliant is that? This means that our bones are constantly detecting their environment and are able to adapt themselves to meet the demands that are placed upon them. So how do they do this? Well, this online learning package, focusing on the skeleton, will get you started. So let's just review the online learning outcomes for this module. Describe the composition and function of the skeleton. Describe the organisation and major bones of the skeleton. Describe structural and functional classifications of joints. And describe examples of movements made available by synovial joints. What does the term skeleton actually mean? Well, it refers to all of the bones and joints in the body. The term joint refers to a site where two bones are connected. If we look at this skeleton, for example, we can identify the elbow joint, where three bones are connecting. This is known as a joint or an arthrosis. Where the bones connect is called an articulation. Joints are very important in the body because they are sites where most movement is occurring, and it therefore enables the body to move. The skeleton itself is made up of three types of specialised connective tissue. These are bone tissue, cartilaginous tissue, and bone marrow. Therefore, all of the functions of the skeleton are derived from the special characteristics of these three connective tissues. Bone marrow is a very special connective tissue. It can be found inside the hollow spaces of bones. You will find that there are two types of bone marrow, red and yellow, where red bone marrow is critical as it is where red and white blood cells are formed. The skeleton has many important functions. Firstly, let's look at the mechanical functions. Due to the rigidity of bones, bones are able to provide the necessary support to the soft tissues of our body to provide our erect posture and body proportions. Imagine your upper limb without any bones. It would be a floppy mess. Bones also protect a number of vital organs, such as the skull, protecting the brain, and the rib cage and sternum, protecting the heart and lungs that lie within the thoracic cavity. Bones also act as perfect muscle attachment sites and levers to facilitate joint movement. Joint movement is an important effect that occurs further to the mechanical functions. Bones also have critical metabolic functions. The large reservoir of calcium ions in bone can be released to maintain calcium homeostasis. Calcium homeostasis is an important Calcium homeostasis is important to balance in the blood, as it is important Calcium is an important ion in cell function. For example, muscle cells require calcium ions in order to contract. As bone marrow is located in the bones of the skeleton, an additional role of the skeleton is hematopoiesis, that is, the production of blood cells. Bones require an extremely large number of blood vessels in order for calcium and blood cells to enter the body's circulation. As mentioned, the skeleton is made up of bone tissue and cartilaginous tissue. Let's look at some of the differences between these two connective tissue types. Firstly, when we look at bone tissue, we can find that its chemical composition is biphasic. This means it consists of two very different phases, an organic phase and an inorganic phase. The organic phase consists of the fibrous material of the bone tissue. The inorganic phase consists of the mineral, which is largely the calcium ions. By having both an organic and an inorganic phase, the bone tissue has a significant amount of toughness, which means it is strong but has a little bit of resilience. If we compare that to cartilaginous tissue, it is monophasic, which means that it only has an organic component which contains a large amount of water. There are no minerals found in cartilaginous tissue. For this reason, cartilaginous tissue is highly flexible, and this is very important to allow increased movement at joint surfaces and at specific joints. Another difference between bone tissue and cartilaginous tissue is how many blood vessels are contained within the tissue. In bone tissue, as mentioned earlier, there is a large number of blood vessels, and therefore the bone tissue is highly vascular. Cartilaginous tissue, on the other hand, is avascular, meaning that there are no blood vessels contained within the cartilaginous tissue. There are a number of cells found within bone tissue and cartilaginous tissue. However, in bone tissue, there are a number of different types of cells that do specific functions. Osteoblasts are the cells that form bone matrix. Osteoclasts are the cells that degrade or break down the bone matrix. And osteocytes are the cells that reside in bone and detect mechanical loads and allow a signal transduction to occur to respond to these signals. On the other hand, cartilaginous tissue contains only one cell type, which is the chondrocytes, and chondrocytes are important for secreting new fibrous material for ongoing maintenance of the matrix of cartilaginous tissue, the organic component. In the background of this slide, you can see a hematoxylin and eosin stain section of a bone organ. In this bone organ, we can see in pink bone tissue. And in these spaces within the bone tissue, you can see these multicolored cells here, which are the cells of the bone marrow. In the central area, you can see this paler blue tissue, which is the cartilaginous tissue. The cartilaginous tissue has a number of chondrocytes that we can see lining up here, but you cannot see any of the blood vessel structures that are obvious within the bone tissue. When we look at a bone organ, there are a number of different regions that can be described. When we look at the shaft of the organ, it has a specific name called the diaphysis. The term diaphysis refers to its position within the middle of the bone and refers to its position relative to this structure here, which is called the epiphyseal plate or line. Hence the term comes from physis, meaning the area of growth. So it is between the two areas of growth called the epiphyseal lines or plates. The proximal epiphysis is the end of the bone that's closer to the trunk of the body. The distal epiphysis is further away from the trunk of the body and is also an end of the bone. The metaphysis regions are the in-between junctional regions between the epiphysis and the main shaft. Note that the metaphysis is a sub-part of the diaphysis. In most bones, there are two metaphyses and two epiphyses, denoting the two ends of the bone. Looking internally at the structure of the bone organ, we can see a very specific arrangement of tissues. Firstly, there is cortical bone. Cortical bone is a subtype of bone tissue which is highly dense and found on the outside of the bone organ. Cortical refers to the term shell, referring to the outer position of the bone. Another type of bone that is found in the bone organ is trabecular bone tissue. It is in the trabecular bone tissue that is highly porous that we find red bone marrow. In the central area of the diaphysis, you find a hollow region. This is called the medullary cavity. In fact, it's not actually hollow in the living person because that space is filled with yellow bone marrow in the adult. Yellow bone marrow is largely composed of adipose tissue or fat. Finally, at the ends of the bones, you can see this white layer of tissue. This is the articular cartilage, which is composed of hyaline cartilaginous tissue and is forming the joint surface where movement occurs. In this real section long bone, we can see again the two types of bone tissue that can be found. The cortical bone tissue, the denser type, forming the outer shell of the bone and is very thick in the diaphysis region. We can see in this photomicrograph the actual morphology of the cortical bone. Note its highly dense structure. These holes are locations where blood vessels will be travelling through the cortical bone. The second type of bone tissue is the trabecular bone tissue. It's highly porous with macroscopic holes. So here you can see the trabecular bone tissue in this real human bone sample. In these pores, you will find the red bone marrow tissue. Note that the trabecular bone tissue is largely located within the epiphyses and metaphyses regions. This is because the trabecular bone is designed to withstand forces in multiple directions that occur at the joint surfaces. When we look at the skeleton, we can divide it into two major areas. In yellow, we can see the axial skeleton, and in green, the appendicular skeleton, which is made up of the bones of the limbs. If we focus our attention first on the yellow axial skeleton, we can see that it consists of the skull, the rib cage, which means the ribs themselves, the costal cartilages, and the sternum, as well as the vertebral column. All of these bones make up the axial skeleton. Let's now look at the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton consists of the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle refers to the clavicle and the scapula. Attached to the pectoral girdle is the bones of the upper limb. More inferiorly, we then have the os coxae, which is another word for the hip bones, and the right and left os coxae articulate to form the pelvic girdle. Finally, we have the lower limb making up the appendicular skeleton, which consists of numerous bones from the femur all the way down to the phalanges of the toes. So let's now name a number of the individual bones of each of these skeletal divisions. Here is the axial skeleton. So firstly, we had the skull. And in this particular image, we're not looking at all of the bones of the skull, but the ones that are visible in an anterior view. You may want to actually palpate your own body as we name these bones to start associating the name of the bone with the region of your body. Anterior on your forehead is the frontal bone. The parietal bone is located on the lateral aspects of your skull, and the temporal bone is just behind your ear. The zygomatic bone forms your cheekbone. The maxilla is your upper jaw. The mandible, your lower jaw. In your neck, you will find this very small single bone called the hyoid bone. This bone is not part of the skull, but is a separate bone within the neck. Then to the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage consists of the sternum, ribs, costal cartilage, and all of the vertebrae. Note that in the previous slide we referred to the term rib cage. Rib cage is the same as thoracic cage, except it does not include the vertebrae. So the rib cage are those organs listed on the left, whereas the thoracic cage are those organs listed to the left as well as those on the right. The vertebral column consists of a number of regions of vertebrae, such as the cervical region in the neck, thoracic in the thoracic region connected to ribs, lumbar in the lumbar region, and then we have the single sacrum and coccyx bones located within the pelvic region. Now let's look at the appendicular skeleton. Because of the amount of movement that occurs in the appendicular skeleton or the limbs, there are a higher number of bones within this region than in the axial skeleton. The pectoral girdle consists of the clavicle, also known as the collarbone in layperson's terms, and the scapula, also known as the shoulder blade in layperson terms. The pectoral girdle then articulates with the upper limb via the humerus, and then two bones within your forearm, the radius, which is the more lateral in the anatomical position, and the ulna, which is more medial. In your hand, you have a number of carpal bones, metacarpal bones, and phalanges of the fingers. Moving down to the more inferior aspects of the appendicular skeleton, we start with the pelvic girdle, which consists of the right and left os coxae. In the lower limb, we have the longest bone of the body, which is the femur, the kneecap or patella, and then in the leg we have the larger tibia, which is medial position, and the smaller fibula, which has a lateral position. In the foot we have a number of small bones called the tarsals in the heel, the metatarsals, and the phalanges in the toes. So this completes the major bones located in the appendicular skeleton. So let's now move our attention to the classification of joints. Remember, joints are also called arthroses. Joints are classified by a combination of their function and structure. The function is the range of movement. Is it highly mobile or is it immobile? The structure refers to what type of tissue links the bones. So here, for example, we can see cartilaginous tissue connecting the two vertebrae. So by firstly looking at the functional classification, we can see that based on the degree of movement, we have a specific term we use to describe that joint. All of these terms are referring to the term arthrosis, meaning joint. Synarthrosis refers to an immobile joint. Amphiarthrosis to a slightly mobile joint, and a diarthrosis is the most common in the body. It's freely mobile. Secondly, let's look at the structural classification of joints. Remember, this is referring to the type of tissue that's located between the two bones. We either have fibrous tissue, cartilaginous tissue, or a synovial joint, which has a space filled with synovial fluid. Each of these structural classifications have subtypes. So it's important in your further learning to explore each of the subtypes of these structural classifications. In this online package, we will be just looking at some of the examples of each of these structural joint classifications. When we refer to the fibrous joints, we're specifically looking at joints that are connected by dense connective tissue. Cartilaginous tissue could be either hyaline or fibrocartilaginous subtypes within a cartilaginous joint. And as mentioned, the synovial joint is filled with a cavity of fluid and it's supported by ligaments. So let's look at an example of a fibrous joint. This joint found in the skull is called a suture. It's where a number of the flat bones of the skull articulate by dense connective tissue binding those two bones together. The majority of the bones of the skull are connected in this way. and therefore all sutures are found in the skull. An example of a cartilaginous joint is a symphysis. Symphyses are joined by fibrocartilage. On this slide we see two different examples of symphyses. The pubic symphysis is the fibrocartilage pad that connects the right and left os coxa in the pelvic girdle. Another example is the intervertebral disc that you find between two adjacent vertebrae. This intervertebral disc is formed by fibrocartilage and is forming a symphysis joint, a cartilaginous joint. We'll look at a number of subtypes of synovial joints. Remember that synovial joints are the most common joint in the body, and they are highly mobile. That is, they are classified as a diarthrosis. Here in the elbow joint, you can see that there are a number of bony articulations, the humerus, radius, and ulna. And as this diagram depicts, these bones move relative to each other like a hinge on a door. A second example of a synovial joint is a condyloid joint. Condyloid joints can be found within the hand between a metacarpal and the proximal phalanx. In condyloid joints, there is a convex surface that meets a concave surface, and these types of joints allow movements in two planes. The final example today of a synovial joint is the ball and socket joint. Ball and socket joints are extremely important in the body because they are the most highly mobile joint. They are able to move the joint in more than 3 planes. Here we can see an example, the glenohumeral joint. The glenohumeral joint or shoulder joint allows the head of the humerus to articulate with the scapula to allow an extremely high range of movement. Another example of a ball and socket joint is your hip joint. Let's look at the internal structure of a typical synovial joint. As the synovial joint is the most common in the body and the most highly mobile, it has a number of special features that enable it to have this important function of mobility. On the left, you can see an illustration depicting the major structures of a typical synovial joint. On the right, you can see a section through the shoulder joint, which is an example of a ball and socket synovial joint. Note here is the head of the humerus, and here is the scapula that it articulates with. Firstly, you can see that there's a distinct darkened cavity here. This darkened cavity, known as the synovial cavity, is filled with synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is actually formed from an epithelial membrane in green here called the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane lines a supportive, fibrous capsule that surrounds the entire synovial joint. Note that the synovial membrane does not extend over the bone surface. It only lines the fibrous capsule on the periphery of the synovial cavity. Lining the actual bone surfaces is the articular cartilage, and the articular cartilage formed from hyaline cartilaginous tissue is extremely important in allowing a lubricated surface and a shock-absorbing pad during the actual loading of a synovial joint. In this real section through the shoulder, we can see this white area of tissue, which is the articular cartilage, lining the bone surface. So wherever there is a joint surface where movement is occurring, articular cartilage always lines those areas where the bones are actually in contact. You will never have a joint where bone is actually articulating with bone directly. The articular cartilage provides an important shock absorber and also a lubricating surface. Within a synovial joint, there's also a number of supporting structures called extracapsular ligaments. These are found outside of the fibrous capsule and will be specific for each synovial joint. Synovial joints, as mentioned, are the most highly mobile within the body, and as such they have specific movements that they produce that are occurring in the anatomical planes of the body. I'm sure all of you have heard of the terms flexion and extension, but let's look at their actual anatomical definitions. Here in the elbow joint, note the actual change in angle that's occurring. When we perform the flexion movement, the angle is decreasing, and when we perform the extension movement, the angle is increasing. Note that these movements are occurring in the sagittal anatomical plane. Another important movement that occurs in the coronal or frontal plane is abduction and adduction. Note the movements that are occurring here at the glenohumeral joint or shoulder joint. Abduction is the movement where we move our hands from this medial position out to this lateral position. It's moving them away from the body. In the opposite direction, we call this adduction, where we're moving the hands via movement of the glenohumeral joint towards the body. This is adduction, ADD. A third movement that occurs is rotation. Rotation specifically occurs along the transverse axis. You can see an example of rotation of the neck, which is occurring in the median atlantoaxial joint, and the rotation of the knee joint here. Note that there are many other specific movements of synovial joints, and it's important that you refer to your manual to go through others that are of importance. Thank you for listening. So let's demonstrate some of those joint positions and movements. Let's start with the elbow joint. Recall that the elbow joint is a type of synovial hinge joint. This joint is able to perform actions in a single plane only, and therefore is called uniplanar. Within these sorts of actions, or uniaxial actions, we'll find the flexion and extension motion. Let's demonstrate. So when we move our forearm closer to our arm, this is known as flexion, and then further away is extension. So the elbow joint performs a uniaxial movement because it's a hinge synovial joint. Let's look at another example in the hand. In the hand we have a number of joints in the fingers. Each of these small joints between adjacent phalanges is called an interphalangeal joint. These joints are also synovial hinge joints, and therefore are able to move in just a single plane and therefore are uniaxial. Let's have a look at the movement. So when we perform this movement of clawing our fingers, this movement is a flexion extension movement of the interphalangeal joints. This also is a movement of a hinge synovial joint. Let's compare this now to our knuckle joints. Our knuckle joints here are located between our metacarpal bones and our proximal phalanges, and therefore are called the metacarpophalangeal joints. Focus here on the 2nd to 5th metacarpophalangeal joint. Now in these joints, they are actually synovial condyloid joints, and therefore are able to move in two planes, and are therefore biaxial. They can perform a flexion and extension movement. Perform that with me. A flexion and extension movement, but also able to move in a second plane where we're able to spread our fingers apart and move them closer together. And this movement is occurring at these metacarpophalangeal joints. So spreading apart is called abduction, ABD, abduction, and bringing them back together is called adduction, ADD. So do that with me. We've got abduction and adduction of the metacarpophalangeal joints along the knuckles here. So that's an example of a synovial condyloid joint, able to move in two planes. The third example of a synovial joint we looked at was the ball and socket joint, the example being our shoulder joint or hip joint. Looking at our glenohumeral joint here, which is the anatomical name for shoulder joint, we can see that there are multiple movements that occur because of the ball and socket structure. We can move it in a movement that's called flexion and extension. We can also move it in a rotation movement, where you see this twisting occurring of the head of the humerus at the scapula. It also can perform an abduction and adduction movement, just like we saw in the metacarpophalangeal joints. The last type of action that occurs at the shoulder joint is called circumduction, where we do this swiveling type motion, like we're forming a cone in the air with our fingertips. Therefore, the shoulder joint, glenohumeral joint, is a multi-axial joint, allowing movement to occur in all three planes of the body. It occurs in the sagittal plane, the coronal plane, and also the transverse plane when we do the rotation of the glenohumeral joints.